Hi, my name's Tim Bruer and I'm a jazz pianist. Robert Levin is a living legend, a concert pianist and musician of the highest order, with a list of achievements too long to go into here. I first became aware of him via the 1992 documentary on improvisation On the Edge by Derek Bailey, which was based on Bailey's book, Musical Improvisation. In the program, Robert was featured as a classical musician who improvised his own cadenzas within the Mozart piano concertos, something that was quite rare at that time. Since then, I've seen him perform a number of times and watched many of his lectures on both improvisation within the classical tradition and on a multitude of subjects, primarily to do with piano performance and the characteristics of various composers. I don't know if I've ever come across anyone with such a vast knowledge of classical music. The sheer comprehensiveness of his grasp on so many elements of the music and his ability to articulate them is mind-boggling, and his passion and energy for the subject is formidable. Not surprisingly, in addition to this, he's also well versed in the area of jazz. As a jazz musician who loves classical music, I thought it would be interesting to have a conversation with Robert about the improvisational aspects of his music making, and perhaps gain some fresh insights into improvisatory practice. His exploration of improvisation began when his conducting teacher, Hans Swarovski, told him that to play Mozart piano concertos authentically, he'd need to improvise his own cadenzas. This part of his career began after extensive studies in his teens with the iconic teacher, Nadia Boulanger, who in Robert's own words, provided him with a musical toolbox of devices and concepts. For context, I spoke with Robert at 3 p.m. his time, which was the rather challenging time of 6 a.m. in Sydney. Unfortunately, there's a few brief moments where the video freezes and the piano sound distorts, particularly towards the end when Robert improvises on some Mozart themes. But I hope you enjoy the conversation and feel inspired to investigate his work. I began by asking him how, after his studies with Boulanger and armed with his so-called toolbox, his substantial compositional awareness, his knowledge of the use of embellishments and perfect pitch, he taught himself to improvise.
Well, Nadia Boulanger taught that imagination was, what she said was that the task of a teacher was to encourage a young musician to follow his or her imagination, his fancy, to unlock their creative willingness to take risks, and beyond that, to be utterly ruthless in questions of discipline. And that combination of freedom and discipline was central. In fact, there's a photograph that was on her piano, whether it was in Paris in her apartment or in Fontainebleau, where she taught during the summer on her piano there, which was signed and dedicated to her by Paul Valéry. And he wrote to Nadia Boulanger, who there it is again. And so what she did was she gave one the facility to be able to realize flights of fancy. And in the case of improvisation, one of the central things was keyboard harmony.
Yes.
The basic rules of voice leading, if you were going to be improvising in a classical style, and by that I don't mean classical with a large C, but a small c, that is going from the Baroque through the classic period and the Romantic period into the 20th century, that you had to have, as a jazz person has to have, a vocabulary of things. You have a fake book, and the fake book says C6, and you know what that means.
Yes.
And it says a D minor 7, and you know what that means, and you know how to do those things. And to some extent in jazz, the way you connect the chords are maybe less important than understanding the succession of the chords. But the idea in the classical era that Nadia Boulanger taught was that you had to have a very clear sense of how the music connects and goes forward, how words make words, words make clauses, clauses make sentences, and sentences make paragraphs. And in order to do that, you have to have a very good sense of voice leading so that you can connect well. So you have a good sense of horizontality and not just verticality.
Yes.
And that in addition to which, a sense of aesthetics would encourage you to have good spacing between the notes of a chord.
Okay.
The C major chord is this, or this, or this, or this, or this.
Yes.
And all of those have a particular flavor and
Yes.
offer particular advantages. So she was very, very keen on one having a sense of well-heard elegance about these things, so that the choices that you made would produce something highly agreeable to the listener.
Yes.
And for every particular kind of chord that one learned additively, from starting with common chords with the root on the bottom, through sixth chords and 6/4 chords and dominant sevenths and so on, there were sets of voice leadings that were indigenous to those chords, and you had to learn them, and you had to learn them flat out. And then she would give you figured basses, which tested your ability to have retained all of those voice leadings. So that, for instance, I mean, sixth chords are an amazing labyrinth of possibilities. There's no chord that's more flexible, actually, than that, because you can have the ability to move in pure melodic parallel motion is peculiar to the sixth chord and to the diminished seventh. But with all of the others, would violate every rule of harmony, because you have parallel fifths and parallel octaves. And
Right.
having learned how to do that with 3 voices, you would then be able to learn with it to do it with 4. Or
Lovely.
and then you could do or and so on and so forth. There are all of these combinations which you then internalize completely. And so then when it's time to venture out on your own, you have, as a good jazz musician, jazz pianist has, you have a very solid vocabulary which enables you to be creative and take risks.
Yes.
Because without risk taking, there's nothing that's really worth doing. And this is one of the great arguments I have, that I pick bones with classical musicians, because so many of them are really into risk avoidance, because they're going into an international competition. If they play 3 wrong notes, the person who played only 2 will get the prize, and they won't.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so they learn to do things in a way that, well, the Germans have this saying. They say, nothing happens, but also nothing happens.
Yeah, I think I've heard you say that once before.
Yes, exactly. I mean, nothing bad happens, but nothing good happens. Or putting it upside down, nothing good happens, but nothing bad happens. And risk avoidance is poisonous, because in order for there to be delight, there has to be risk. And there has to be a sense of suspense.
Yes.
And if a director like Alfred Hitchcock can do it, and a composer like Schumann or Brahms can do it, then we should be able to recapitulate that when we play ourselves. So having gotten this vocabulary and this discipline from Nadia Boulanger, when it came time to start to do the things that the conductor Hans Swarovski suggested, I was able to, should we say, separate the tasks into certain genres. For instance, if you're going to play along with the orchestra during the tutti sections, where there's nothing actually written
Okay.
with the right hand of the piano to play, but the left hand is directed to double the string bass. Not the cello if there's no string bass, and not the bassoon if there are no strings playing bass at all, but the string bass, then that is giving you the basis for what you do. And so whether in fact you're Mozart playing a piano concerto, playing along, busking along with the tuttis as they prepare your solo entrance on the one hand, or on the other hand, you are trying to be a little bit like Duke Ellington or Count Basie,
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes.
Where the band is playing away and suddenly, you hear, you say, oh, Mountain Town, you hear what Basie is doing, and it stimulates your appetite, because sooner or later he's going to play a solo, but it's not yet, but he's there. He's in the mix with everything.
Yes.
And the same thing is true when you're playing along with the tutis. You're going to do little things. Maybe it's a wicked little trill that you play just for the audience to know that you're there. Or maybe you're doubling some of the chords that are being played by some of the other instruments of the orchestra. But it's a way psychologically of saying that something is up, and sooner or later, daredevil and entertaining things will happen. So there's that kind of thing. Then there's the kind of thing of when a tune comes back that you're going to decorate it.
Yes.
Because, I mean, yes, there are people who wear the same clothes every single day, one day after another, and 6 months after you saw them last, they're still wearing that same shirt. But most people tend to have a vocabulary of clothing, and the music has a vocabulary of expression. So if you're going to play a tune, I mean, when he hears in Mozart concertos, when he writes out the piano part, he doesn't write out variations because he's the one that's playing, and he can count upon himself to play the first thing that comes into his head. But the orchestra, which is mostly sight reading, is not preparing. And therefore, Mozart, knowing that they don't have a clear avenue to use their imagination, he writes out the decorations for them.
Yes.
So you hear the piano playing, and you hear the orchestra go, and you think, well, isn't this strange? Isn't it strange that the orchestra seems to have more imagination than the soloist?
Right.
If that's the case, then it seems to me you need to sack the pianist and get somebody who's got a bit more of a sense of invention.
Yeah.
You see? So there are all of these things. Then, of course, there's the orchestra pulls up to a 6/4 chord and says to the soloist, okay, it's up to you, make something happen. And they are going to wait on the other side of the precipice, and the soloist launches, shoots a crossbow, and gets on the tightrope and manages to get from one side of the mountain chain to the other. And of course, everybody wants the soloist to succeed. They don't know what's going to happen. Which means that if you're playing a Mozart or a Beethoven concerto and you play the cadenzas that they wrote, the audience knows perfectly well what you're going to do because they've heard it in 25 recordings and they've heard it live. And it's not very interesting.
Yes.
Of course, it's great music because Beethoven composed a cadenza that's better than I'm going to improvise. But on the other hand, the adventure of the whole thing is much more interesting if the audience knows the piece, and in the middle of knowing the piece, they know they're going to hear some tunes they've heard before, but what happens to those tunes, the whole sense of anything being on the table makes life rather exciting. And usually it gets very, very still. When I'm playing and I'm improvising cadenzas, it gets very still in the audience when the orchestra stops. And when you get to the end and the orchestra comes in, you can hear the audience go, and they exhale because they know it's dangerous. And to me, this is a very important aspect of keeping the art of playing traditional music alive, because if nothing is left to chance, then it's not terribly exciting.
I read a lovely quote attributed to Gustav Mahler, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and I only read it last night. I'm trying to think what it was. It was a response to, that's right, a lovely performance of a Bach lute suite. And it was something like, the tradition isn't the preservation of, something about the ashes, but just the preservation of fire. I'm sorry, I've messed up the quote, but it was a lovely quote that was that what you just said made me.
Well, when he was conducting the Vienna court orchestra, the opera orchestra, and one of the musicians had the temerity to say that what he was asking from them did not correspond to their tradition, he looked at them and said, "Your tradition is slovenliness." Eure Tradition ist Schlamperei. And someone said tradition is simply the last bad performance. I wouldn't go that far because there's a lot to learn and there's a lot to absorb. But the idea is to converse in a language which is comprehensible to the listener. And if the listener grasps what you're trying to say, then you can make music happen. And you create music not that is something, but music that does something. And that, I think, is a very, very important aspect of improvisation, to understand that there's a lot that can go wrong, there's a lot that can go right, but the most important thing about it, and actually the most important thing about musical performance as a whole, is storytelling.
Yes, I agree.
And if you don't tell a story, then nobody should be interested in listening. So something is going to happen and you don't know when. And sometimes I'll be improvising. I'm sure you have experienced this too. And suddenly you play a very strange note.
Mm-hmm.
You think, well, that wasn't very good, was it? And, well, what am I going to do now? Well, if it's made you take a sharp right turn across the meadow, then you're just going to have to take a sharp right turn and see what the consequences of that are going to be, which could turn out to be absolutely wonderful, or they could turn out to be dreadful. But in the meantime, you're stuck with it.
Yes. Yeah,
You know, it's like being on a super highway and your friend tells you you get off at exit number 25 and you go to the bottom of the ramp and hang a left turn and go until you see the petrol station. And when you see that petrol station, you're going to make a right and go up 3 blocks, and our house is on the left, which is fine. And you're getting off the motorway and you get down to exit 29, and all of a sudden, instead of making a left, you make a right. And suddenly there's no petrol station and there's no right turn and there's no dinner and nothing works. So for those people who feel that they will actually create a cadenza by not exactly improvising, they'll plan what they're going to do without actually writing it down. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a navigation system. And the navigation system is good as far as it goes, but suppose your fingers do wrong things. If they do things other than what you proposed in your navigation as you lay in bed resting at 5 in the afternoon before the 8 p.m. concert, then suddenly you have 2 choices. Either you are where you are because you did what you did, and you'd better go with that, or you look over your shoulder and say, what was I supposed to be doing? And by doing that, you're going to drive your car into
the chain. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be a complete calamity.
So how do you reconcile that so-called wrong turn with the overall stylistic context?
Well, that's a question, of course, that can be answered differently by different people. Mm-hmm. For instance, you can improvise a terrific cadenza to a concerto in a style completely different from that of the composer.
I have heard somebody do that. It was actually on my mind last night in preparation for this, and there was a guy, a beautiful player, I think his name was Robert Levin. Whether you've heard of him or not, I don't know, but there's a clip of him playing a Mozart concerto, and when the cadenza comes, he basically goes into what I would say is pretty much a Keith Jarrett mode, because so many of us jazz pianists have been influenced, should I say, by Keith, of course, who is probably my favourite musician of all time. The stylistic vocabulary that he draws on is entirely different to the Mozart, and even though I love it on its own, it doesn't do it for me aesthetically. So this is what you're saying. Yeah.
The problem is that it's easier to push into the future and get into the romantic or even an abstract style. But what's much more difficult if you're playing Beethoven or Mozart is to come back and find a plausible way to be inside that stylistic region and convince the audience that you've come home.
Yes.
I mean, even between Mozart and Beethoven, there are some interesting distinctions in how they regard the possibilities. Mozart, for instance, never wrote a cadenza that modulates. Every one of his cadenzas stay in the home key, yes, which you can understand, because it's the most important thing about what prompts the cadenza is waiting to see how it's going to save itself and get to the end. So to go in a C major concerto to the key of E flat major or the key of G flat major or E major would strike him as being completely inappropriate, but Beethoven does it all of the time.
Yes.
Of course, once you get out of the tonic key, if you get out of C major and you go to F sharp major, then the basic expectation of the audience that you're going to find your way out of the gunny sack in which you've been wrapped and get out of it and stand up and cheer, the sense of expectation of the inevitable disappears because you're now in a completely different land. So that can be a problem. It's a Back to the Future type thing with Michael Fox and his DeLorean, and Christopher Lloyd working from the present to the past and back into the future. It's fun, but on the other hand, think about the fact, this is an analogy I make very frequently. Think about people who make films. When they make films, there are people that are paid a great deal of money to make sure that everything corresponds to the period in which the film is being shot. If it's a gangster movie in 1927 Chicago, they've got to be sure that there are no 1943 Studebakers or 1950 Cadillacs driving around on the street, and ideally that none of the buildings that you see are buildings that were constructed after the time that the film was being made. Yes. And that the costumes, the dresses that the women wear and their hats correspond to the age of the flappers. And if they don't do that, a lot of people may not notice it. There's one of the films based on Jane Austen. I can't recall whether it was Sense and Sensibility or Pride and Prejudice. There's a beautiful outdoor shot, and at a certain point, an airplane flies by.
Yes.
And, for anybody who has a clear sense of the relationship between the era of the movie and ours would burst into laughter, because it's absolutely grotesque. I mean, if you're filming a film about, let's say, I don't know, the Crimean War, or the War of 1812 with Napoleon and the Russians, it would be very strange if you heard machine gun fire.
Yes,
but the point,
as a kid, perhaps that in the movie Ben-Hur, somebody was caught wearing a watch, but I might be wrong.
That's right. I think that's exactly right. Yeah, or suddenly, if an automobile just sped past at the Coliseum. But the funny thing about that, Tim, is that a lot of people wouldn't notice it, because they're used to seeing airplanes fly through the sky. So there's an airplane flying through the sky. The sudden idea that, wait a minute, this is 1795. I mean, they had balloons.
Yes.
Mozart was in France when Mr. Montgolfier flew above the French countryside, and it must have been an absolutely inebriating experience for him. But for me, I feel that if I'm going to do this in a way which corresponds to that Hollywood approach, and not have the wrong Chevrolet or the wrong Oldsmobile or Mercedes-Benz around, what I need to do is to try to live within the sonic world and the stylistic world of the piece as the composer has written it. And the same thing is true when decorating, because even a couple of notes that you add to a particular melody may very easily produce something that isn't quite right.
Yes.
I remember years and years ago when I was teaching music theory at the Curtis Institute of Music, a student had turned in a harmony exercise, and I had written above a particular progression, I'd written style ?
Yes.
And this young musician came up to me after the end of the class. He said, "Mr. Levin, I don't understand. What do you mean by style here?" And I thought, what's the easiest way to explain that to him? And I thought the easiest way to do it is not in words, but in sound. And so I went. And he looked at me and said, I think I understand what you're saying.
Right. Yes.
And in fact, the answer that I devised does what the answer to the Beethoven question should be. He's asking a question and you get an answer. So I go from C to G and I go from G back to C. The problem is that the language itself is a couple 100 years off.
Right.
And
yes.
That becomes very amusing,
yes.
Certainly, but it would seem a rather peculiar thing to do in a live concert.
So you're saying that if you take this so-called wrong turn, that you're at a point in that situation where obviously this stylistic consistency, if you want to phrase it that way, is pretty front and center of your mind, that you have a very important decision to make at that point in time.
Well, I have to live within the stylistic givens of a particular language, and so knowing that Beethoven modulates in his cadenzas, I flip the switch in my brain that says modulation's permitted and encouraged.
So and that's what happens in the Mozart, though.
Right. In the Mozart, it's not so good. But, the funny thing is, Tim, most people would not notice it. And most distinguished pianists who compose their cadenzas to Mozart concertos when we have a concerto for which he did not leave them or they have not come down to us. And very often these people who have an invidious knowledge of Mozart's style will compose a cadenza that modulates. Apparently, they never noticed that Mozart cadenzas never modulate. But that's one of the things about defining an authentic image of that particular time. And there are other things too. I mean, for instance, the fact that Mozart's piano is exactly 5 octaves in range, going from here to here. So if you play a note that's above or below that, most people, having heard lots and lots of pieces that use the higher notes and the lower notes of the piano, might not blink.
Yes, correct, yes.
But there is one F sharp in one piece by Mozart, which proves that the young lady for whom he wrote the piece had a piano which had an F sharp and a G. So he amused himself by writing one, but it never occurred to him that that meant that his piano was obsolescent and that he should get himself a piano that likewise went up to F sharp and G.
Right.
But the F sharp is not a wrong note in that sonata for 2 pianos.
Right.
And it just shows his propensity for writing were exactly the kind of characteristics that a particular player or a particular instrument might have.
Yes.
You know, so that mattered a great deal to him. But you know, you look at Beethoven. He lived during a time when the piano evolved more rapidly than anything except maybe nowadays the computer has evolved. And so it grew in its range from leaps and bounds. He started with the same 5 octaves as Mozart, then 5 octaves and 2 notes, then 5 octaves and 4 notes, then 5.5 octaves, then 6 octaves. You get to the Hammerklavier and you have a much larger instrument. But the cadenzas that he wrote for his own piano concertos, which he wrote in 1809, later than the early first 3, those do not make any effort to adhere to the range of the piano as it existed when he wrote the concerto. So they go into the stratosphere, and when you listen to the second piano concerto, this one, and you have with this fugato, it ends up sounding like the Hammerklavier sonata. It sounds like the latest of late Beethoven. And then suddenly you go, and the orchestra goes, and you're back in 1795.
Right, yes.
So, I mean, Beethoven and Mozart, when he wrote cadenzas to his earlier concertos, he wrote them in the style of his later concertos. That didn't seem to bother him. So you might say, why should it bother us? I think it's worth bothering us.
Right, yes, I hear you. So
it's like cuisine, you know? It's like the flavors in a well-prepared meal.
So can you go back, though, and give us a little bit more information on how you proceeded with after having the toolbox from Nadia and to the point where you felt confident to improvise in public? Well,
I started to look at his cadenzas to be sure, just to see if there was any sense of consistency in how he put a cadenza together. And it's not altogether formulaic. But there's a springboard at the beginning sometimes in which you just play a bit of passage work, 16th note semiquavers, and then you get to a tune. Probably the tune is most likely to be from the first section of the exposition or the first tutti, and then maybe there'll be a sequence, and then after that there will come a pause, and after the pause you get something from the second section of the piece, and then there's another sequence. And then he builds up tension, lets off steam, sends a scale rapidly from the bottom to the top of the piano, and then gives us a trill, and it's over. The whole thing doesn't last much more than a minute and a half. And you adapt the tunes to what's possible. And what I tell my students is, take a look at a Mozart cadenza, put it on your writing desk, and put to the right of it a score of the piece.
Yes.
And go from bar to bar in the cadenza and see if you can trace the origins of everything that's there.
Yes, I hear you. Yep.
So, for instance, if I take, and I actually use this example in my article on the subject in the New Grove, if you take the 17th concerto, K453, Mozart starts the cadenza, so that's quite clearly derived from the first tune. The next thing he does is which actually turns out to be the last thing you heard before the tutti, because the flute is playing. So this, he's just combined the very first idea with the virtual last idea. And then, and you think, oh my God, that's so fantastic. What an incredibly unexpected thing. Now, I never would have invented that. How would I have ever guessed that? Well, you would have guessed it if you listened to him earlier in the piece when he went. So you see, that's borrowed. And then you can.
That's a modulation, correct?
Well, no, it's not. Actually, what it is, it's what we call a deceptive cadence, which could be this, or because he doesn't go on and go.
Okay. Yes.
See, he can threaten to do something. He's just not allowed to do it.
Yeah, I didn't hear. I heard it when you hit that chord, but I didn't hear it follow through. So it sounded
That's right.
like it might have been going somewhere else. Yes.
You see, I mean, Mozart can threaten. Few were rescued.
Yes,
you see,
yes.
so threatening people, and Beethoven does this too. He says, I might do it, I could do it, I could no, I'm not going to do it. And the person who actually does do it is the person that you mentioned earlier in our conversation, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, who is a radical person in terms of some of the wild things that he did. He's a very, very modern composer and speaks very much from his own inner spirit. So things happen that are just shocking. So in one of his orchestra symphonies in D major, he gets to the end of the first movement, and we think he's going to go, which everyone always does, and he goes.
So he does move to E flat. Yes.
That's the end of the movement.
Oh wow.
And you think, you're kidding.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, you can't do that. And he says, well, I just did it. You see, in the second movement is an E flat major.
Yes.
And at the end of it, there's a little transition back, and then you get back to D major, and you have a finale in D major. So he actually carries out what he threatened to do. And the funny thing is that most people say, oh, the idea of it is very exciting, but when it actually happens, they feel, no, wait a minute. You can't do that. So you see, so Mozart can occasionally threaten to do it as he does here, but then he goes right on, which is again the first idea, and then he does this, which comes from somewhere else in the movement, and then he does this, and that he plays. First thing that the piano plays is that. So I can go through the whole piece and show how every single idea in that cadenza comes from someplace. He's taken little snippets of things and pasted them together. And the result of that is, because he's randomly darting around and doing that with his mucilage, it sounds as if he's making this stuff up. It sounds perfectly improvised because nothing is happening in a foreordained order.
Yes.
And that's at the same time, and he's teaching his pupils, this is how to do it. You know,
you being one of the pupils.
Yeah, I mean, you can learn a great deal if you have your eyes and your ears open.
Of course.
So you get used to that, and then you start to see how things can lead to, one thing can lead to something else. Making something stable into something unstable is very, very important, because if you're hearing this, then in fact it's boring, and you're no longer feeling a sense of expectancy that soon there's going to be a trill and the orchestra is going to come back in, because everything is so rooted in the present. So that's why Mozart does not do this. Because you see, that's completely stable and boring. What he does is, so he's giving you this, which because of this dissonant interval of the fourth is unstable, whereas this is stable.
I I hear you. Yep.
makes the distinction between those things.
I hear you.
Or the second tune. There's a nice little descending sequence, which is then developed and comes back home. In the cadenza, it becomes. Really?
Yeah.
He is going quite off the deep end there, and at this point, the next chord will be F major, which is completely impossible in a G major concerto.
Right.
So he's on the brink of violating the very laws that he upholds.
Yes.
And he has to somehow save himself. And at that very last moment, he goes, "Whew! That was a close shave."
So I kind of understand how you must have worked your way through that process now, and thank you for
Exactly.
that.
I'm not doing anything that anybody else who just opens up the music and looks at it can see, provided you want to simply develop a balance between what the solo does alone and what you've experienced in the 10 minutes of music that have led up to that.
Yes. So when you came to improvising the Fantasias, that's a different situation, obviously, less constrained, I assume. Can you talk about how you maybe moved from the improvisation of cadenzas to the improvisation of free fantasias, and how you see the difference between those two things?
Well, it's very interesting that historically, even the greatest virtuosos did not improvise sonatas, because sonatas have a very clear thematic content and an architectural aspect of things.
Yes.
And if you're going to improvise a sonata, what happens when you get back to the recapitulation, to the return, where the material has to follow itself in a precise order, and now it stays home instead of going to a foreign key? And to be able to keep that much information in your head is something that most people have decided not to do. So the preeminent purposes of improvisation were free fantasies and cadenzas, long and short.
Yes.
Those were, as well as, of course, decoration. And so the way I got into this was, of course, the improvisation of cadenzas is a necessity.
Yes.
From an idealistic point of view. If I'm going to play a Mozart concerto and there are no Mozart cadenzas to it, I've got to play something.
Mm-hmm.
So the only question is, do I steal from somebody else? Do I compose something? Or do I improvise it? And Hans Swarovski told me memorably in Nice when I was studying conducting with him, you have to improvise, and pointed out this record he had made with Friedrich Gulda.
Yes, I've just been listening to that in preparation to this interview, actually. Yes.
It's quite a shocker, you know.
I'm very frustrated that there seems to be one biography of Gulda that is in German, and for me that's a problem, even though I did learn German a little bit when I was young. So I have no idea as to the quality of it, but this guy seems to be somebody that warrants a whole lot more investigation, personally.
Well, he was a great Beethoven and Mozart interpreter, just listening to that, but he was tremendously creative, and he played jazz quite well,
of
actually.
Course, yes.
And that, I think, has a great deal to do with his versatility. I wish that I had met him. I own many of his recordings, and I venerate him. I know his son, Paul, very well.
Okay.
We sat in a jury together, a Mozart competition in Salzburg. But the whole sense of doing cadenzas, because the purpose of a cadenza is the unforeseeable. The whole point of it is something's going to happen here. And even when the audience was going to hear a concerto or an aria that was being performed for the very first time, so they had no prior familiarity with the tunes or anything else, nonetheless, they knew that the aria or the concerto was written by somebody, but that the performer would be responsible for the cadenza. And Mozart's written cadenzas are written for his pupils who needed ponies. They didn't know how to do this, so he had to show them how to do it, the way Bach would show his pupils how to decorate sarabands in his English suites. You know, you had to teach them this. And you know, when you play the 48 of Bach, he's teaching you how to compose, he's teaching you how to perform, he's teaching you how to improvise, he's teaching you all sorts of things, because he was first and foremost a teacher, and Mozart did a lot of teaching. Beethoven did a lot of teaching as well. So once I got into the idea that I'm going to improvise these cadenzas because that's the spirit of it, that's the purpose of it. The purpose of a cadenza was never to play something that was fixed on paper and that everybody knew.
Yes, of course. Yes.
The whole device has no meaning. If you haven't convinced an audience that you have the chops necessary to play the movement proper, what is it that you're going to do in a 1.5 to 2 minutes in that cadenza that's going to change the audience's mind? Nothing. You see? So the point of the whole thing is to show not how the singer sings or the instrumentalist can play, but how they think.
Yes.
Whether they are creative, whether they're imaginative, whether they are prone to taking risks, whether they can get the blood pressure of the audience whipped up to a frenzy. So I that's what got me started in doing this, thanks to Swarovski. Then, many years later, I'd been doing this, I don't know, for 15, 20 years. I was invited by Gidon Kramer to his chamber music festival in Lockenhaus in Austria, near the Hungarian border. And every concert had a theme. And this was in 1987. So one of the themes was Guest at Mozart's 1787. Because he figured there were some pieces from 1787 that could be played. The Eine kleine Nachtmusik Serenade and the musical joke and the four-hand piano sonata in C major. There are a number of pieces in 1787, A major violin sonata and so on. But he was afraid that that wouldn't be enough for a marathon concert. So he asked all of us if we could suggest additional pieces for that program, and maybe something not by Mozart. And in a moment of sheer folly, I wrote him back and I said, well, how about I improvise a fantasy in the style of Mozart?
Okay.
And I mailed this off to him, and 2 days later he called me on the phone. He said, we're definitely going to do that. Absolutely. And I thought, my God, what have I committed myself to doing? And I thought, there's a problem with this, a potential problem with this. I'm playing this in Austria. And for the Austrians, Mozart is their cultural property. So they're going to be offended from the get-go, first of all. Second of all, suppose I walk out on stage and I improvise a 15-minute fantasy. What are these people going to say? They're going to say, you must think that we're complete fools. We weren't born yesterday. You sat down and you composed this piece and you memorized it and you're foisting it on us as if you had made it up. Nonsense. And I thought, how am I actually going to pass the credibility gate and convince these people that I'm actually making this up and taking the enormous risk and danger of doing that? And I thought, wait a minute, I'll have the audience compose the tunes.
That's right, yes. And
then they
in Adelaide, we did that with the Beethoven. I've seen you do it, yeah.
Yeah, if you are using the materials, the tunes that they give, in a very narrow sort of way, developing them so that most of the piece consists of that melodic material, then the chances that you were able to conceive this in advance and prepare it are close to zero.
Yes, of course. So
that's how I got to do that, and the audience actually was quite tickled by it, and it became a sort of a parlor trick that I ended up doing a lot, very often playing concertos with an orchestra. And after the interval, I'd come out and an usher would come up with a basket or a fishbowl full of these tunes that the audience had written, and I'd draw anywhere from 2 to 4 of them out of the receptacle and put them up on the piano. And if the tunes were in related keys, then it would be easy to move from one key to the next. But if they were in miles and miles apart, then I would have to get from France to Greece. And that made things rather interesting. And later on, my uncle made a really wonderful suggestion. He said, make sure that they put their names on the snippets of paper, because then when you choose the tunes that you're going to use, you can say, well, Mr. Smith, please get up and acknowledge the applause because we're using his tune. And that way people could realize that they were hearing something unique. It was something that happened that night. And if they came to the concert the next night, and I improvised another fantasy, the tunes would be different, the whole thing would be completely, and it means that the audience themselves becomes part of the performance, and they have a stake in it. So that was a very useful suggestion that my uncle had.
Yes, well, I remember enjoying immensely the one you did in Adelaide at the Beethoven Festival. It must have been eight years ago or something of that. that
I
time.
remember that with Nick McGeegan. Yeah.
And I remember the audience loved it too. We were extremely impressed. It was, it was a great experience. So
Fantastic.
there's one thing that I wanted to talk to you about, and that is that from my beginnings as a jazz player, I was intrigued from early on when I would record my own performances and would, prior to hearing the playback, would think, oh, I'm really glad I got that device, that lick, that thing into the performance. I'm so looking forward to hearing that. So I'll, feel satisfied and proud of myself for fitting that little thing that I worked on into the narrative. And what I remember being struck with, and this is very early on, early 80s, I suppose, is that the thing that I thought about sounded contrived, yet there was a whole lot of other stuff that I didn't really think about at the time. It just sounded great and natural. And ever since that time, my interest was totally piqued as to what was going on with all of this stuff. And I actually began my master's degree, which for perhaps your own interest, I ended up doing on Keith Jarrett. But before I changed the topic to Keith Jarrett, my sort of thesis topic was, do you think when you improvise? And as a more experienced improviser now, I've come around to the understanding now that you generally try and avoid thinking, and that you might start off having a certain amount of consciousness, but you hope that you kind of get absent-minded and unconscious, and the thing just flows from there. And just in addition to that, at the time when I started becoming a jazz player in the late 70s, early 80s, there was almost no information about this more intangible aspect of the process. Whereas today, I don't know if you've heard of Kenny Werner, but he wrote a book some 20 years ago. He's a great jazz pianist, called Effortless Mastery. That's the basic core premise of that, is to practice or to play without thinking and just let your hands move around on the keys. Obviously, the stylistic aspect that we've been discussing in your situation doesn't apply, because you could play anything at all. But there seems to be a lot more information now about that side of things, the psychological, if you like, or the more intangible. And I just wondered, given what I've just said, what your response to that is, and what your experiences might be with those two ways of looking at it, or the lack of thinking, et cetera, that I've expressed there.
Well, lack of thinking literally means that the subconscious development that one has in by osmosis, becoming familiar with patterns and ideas and harmonic vocabulary, that all of this seeps into the subconscious and is there, animating your fingers, whether you are consciously aware of it or not, doesn't matter. It's latent.
Yes.
And so as you get involved in what you're doing, there are epiphanies. I mean, very often I have to say, when I'm improvising, I get the feeling that I'm watching myself.
There you go. This is the sort of thing I'm talking about. Yes.
No, it's not a body thing. And I mean, in one particular case, I was playing the Beethoven First Concerto in Bremen at the music festival with Sir John Eliot Gardner, and there I am in C major. And suddenly I found myself in F sharp major, and I thought, this is horrible. I mean, I'm literally halfway around the globe. I mean, it was like, I remember when I had to fly to Australia from Boston, and I called my travel agent. I said, I need to get to Perth. What's the fastest way to get there? And she said, do you want to go westbound or eastbound? I said, oh, I'd like to go the way which is fastest. She said, you want to go westbound? And I said to her, I don't think I like the direction this conversation is taking. Are you trying to tell me that there's no difference? She said, that's what I'm trying to tell you.
Right.
You can go Boston, Los Angeles, Melbourne, or Sydney and Perth, or you can go Boston, London, Singapore, Perth. It doesn't make a bit of difference.
Right.
And so, here you are, you're improvising, and you go in this direction, you go in that direction. And there I was in F sharp major, halfway around the world, from Boston to Perth. And I looked at the keys of the instrument and looked down and silently said, help me, help me.
Yeah.
And I sat looking at myself for these, it felt like an hour, but it was only probably about 2 seconds.
Yes.
I fancied that the keys were looking back at me and said, "You got yourself into this, you can bloody well get yourself out of it again."
Yeah. Yep.
And I started to play and I tripped on the banana peel. I slipped on the banana peel of a diminished seventh chord, and the next thing you knew, I was home. And I have no idea how I did it. None.
Yeah.
But if I'm improvising a fantasy and I have tunes which are given,
Yes.
and the first one that's there is in the key of B flat, and the next one is in the key of E minor, I have to be aware of the necessity of getting myself at a certain point, not the beginning, but a certain point from E flat to E minor. So I need to glance up at the scrap of paper that shows me that tune in E minor, reminding me that that's where I have to go. And then I'm piloting my plane,
Yes.
and I have to get the plane into a smooth landing. And sometimes I get very close, and sometimes I make a wrong turn, and I end up being 400 miles out, and I've got to come all the way back and then make another landing. The audience may not notice that, but I sure as hell do.
Yes.
And what all of this is also leads into is the increased attention that psychologists are giving to improvisation, the concept of the improvising mind.
Yes.
Aaron Berkowitz has written a book about that, in which I'm one of his guinea pigs, in which he takes my improvisations of cadenzas for a Mozart piano concerto, 3 or 4 of them that are done live, and compares them. And I was just doing a session at the Guildhall School in London with David Dolan, who's a magnificent classical improviser and teaches classical improvisation at the Guildhall School at the Barbican in London. And he was there together with 2 other people who were in the world of psychology, and talking about brain activity.
Yes.
And talking about the effect of someone who is playing a prepared performance of, say, a classical piece, and someone who is playing a more improvised performance.
I think I've seen something about this. Yes.
Very, very interesting.
Absolutely.
You know, I mean, you and I, being practitioners, could look at them and say, "Sounds good to me," you know, rather than, because that just in what improvisers do doesn't mean that that's what you or I or Keith Jarrett does when we play. You know, but it's still interesting if people can point to processes like that, because they can help explain a little we do what we do, and that's I think very exciting.
And you're not, to be clear, you're not talking about these ones where they actually wire the people's heads up to a computer while they're playing.
Some of them do. Some of them do, not all of them. Some of them just do audio visual things.
Yep.
But they do the sensors and all of that, and revelations about brain activity that are really very, very interesting.
Yes, yes. I do have lots of questions, but we're getting towards the hour. There was one thing that I'd say, there's many questions that are as yet unanswered, but
I answered them too long.
No, it's been absolutely joyful, and I'm not trying to bring things to a halt, but I'm just saying that there are many questions that I probably won't get through today, but one of them was in reference to you mentioning about a great classical improviser. And it seems to me during COVID, I've spent a lot of time on YouTube watching you amongst other people. And it seems to me that my suspicion is that there are some more people improvising within the classical tradition than perhaps there were, say, 10 years ago. Would you
definitely
agree with that?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I find so encouraging, since if I were an egotist, I'd find this discouraging, but I find it very encouraging, is that you point young musicians in this direction and you encourage their creativity and encourage their risk-taking, and they find it much easier to immerse themselves in this and to plunge in, and they get to the goal of idiomatic improvisation much faster than what I had to do at a time when I was almost the only person around who was doing it. So it's very encouraging to me to see this happen. I mean, they say that if you throw an infant into a pool of water, that the infant will swim immediately.
Right. Yep.
And then later forgets how to do it and has to be taught again.
Okay. Wow, that's interesting.
You know, the ontology, the whole process of evolution as you grow up. Who's to say? I mean, it's a formula, it's a philosophy that's been debunked by certain people. But the whole idea that you can take somebody with an open mind who is not brought up in this pious way that says you must play exactly what's on the page. You know, so many young musicians will come into a piano lesson and they'll play a piece by Schubert or Schumann and so on, and they'll improvise a little bit. They'll do some things, and they get the ruler slapped on their hands and saying, "That's not your job. That's not what you want to do. You play what's there." And once you've driven the creativity out, it becomes much more difficult to get it back in again.
Yes, I've always thought it odd that when kids start, I don't know whether they call it kindergarten in America, but
Yes.
start kindergarten, you know, they're encouraged to paint and to start using their alphabet in creative ways. But the whole musical thing seems to have a whole other different attitude toward it. Whereas I just think, like, get on an instrument, start making music, you know, to improvise and be as creative as you are with those other disciplines just should be an absolutely natural thing, should be encouraged from the word go. That's my feeling.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, you have people who make pencil sketches, you know, just very, very quickly.
Yep.
And it's not terribly different, you know. It's a way of looking at communication, because I mean that's the whole thing, isn't it? I mean, there are jazz musicians just as there are classical musicians who play for themselves, and they either tolerate or barely tolerate the presence of other people, but they're really not trying to communicate. To me, that's interesting, but it's not the point. I mean, the point is to bring humanity together. The point is to share experience, to play a piece of music which somehow reminds us of experiences that we've had, and that's capable of out and out laughter or moving us to tears, because there's something allegorical, something metaphorical about what this music is doing, and we think this is uncanny. This makes me feel like something that happened to me. How can I listen to a snippet of a piece of music and suddenly I feel that it takes me back to that time 12 years ago when I went out with her for the first time, and oh my God, you know, we went back to my place, and we'll never talk about the rest of that. And you remember these things, and the nostalgia is absolutely overwhelming, and music can do that.
Or in just in a more general sense, I've heard people, including Keith Jarrett, who we keep coming back to, talking about changing molecules. I've heard people talk about that a lot. It's just so it has an effect, whatever that might be, it changes something.
Well, you know, you can admire people who play with dexterity, but you will not so often be moved by it.
Correct. Actually, that leads me to one of the other questions I didn't think I'd get round to, but seeming you've put it out there, and that is the sort of classical tradition of going through all of the technical work and Hannon and Czerny and all of that sort of stuff with regards to dexterity and so on, and how that really connects or maps to the music. And I've always used many times on piano teachers forums, because I teach as well, a phrase that I love of Andras Schiff's, when he says, "Finger exercises are a waste of time, just play Bach." So you hear what I'm saying? Do you think that the normal diet of sort of technical work that for simplicity's sake a traditional classical teacher might give their piano students is quite a bit of wasted effort, wasted time there? What do you think about that?
Well, one of the most insidious things that teachers of young children promulgate is, first you learn the notes and then you add the expression.
Right.
And I mean, it's not only rubbish, it's pernicious. I mean, would anyone ever say first you cook the food and then you add the flavor?
Right, yes.
So by the time your piece of beef is the consistency of shoe leather, it's too late to save the enterprise. And on the other hand, it seems to me that if you get all of your technique from playing great repertoire, that can be something of a risk, because it uses the repertoire for banal purposes. It gives you, you know, if you practice E flat major scales and E flat major arpeggios, you will be able to play every piece in E flat major 60% very, very well.
Right.
So it will prepare a large number of pieces and not just one. Whereas if you learn the peculiar attributes of a single piece, then every time you learn another piece, you have to start all over again. So Andras is a master pianist, and I'm proud to say that he's a good friend of mine. In fact, I just got an email from him a few minutes before we began this conversation,
How lovely.
commiserating about this terrible business with COVID and what it's done to our creative lives. I certainly think that Bach will teach you anything that you need to know about everything, but spending 10 or 15 minutes a day strengthening your muscles and giving yourself a general vocabulary that will help you approach a large number of pieces is not a waste of time. What is a waste of time is spending hours and hours and hours doing scales and arpeggios. Okay. That's mind numbing, it's anti-artistic, and it puts the mechanical element in front of the expressive one, and that cannot be right.
That's a good answer. Thank you for that. That's really quite illuminating. I feel like we might have got to that point where I might ask you if you could improvise for us, Robert, if that's okay.
Sure.
There are questions, as I've said, I haven't got to, and perhaps if you were amenable at a later date, maybe we could do one more of these. But
okay, that certainly would be a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
You're going to give me a tune or two?
Yes. Well, the one that I had in mind was the Rondo in A minor K511, which I love because of its sort of exotic dissonant flavour.
Very wonderful.
And I have to admit, I'm not hugely across the Mozart repertoire, but I did quite a bit of research. And the other one I came up because you said you wanted at least two, so I've got one more. The Adagio in B minor K540. Oh,
so two minor key pieces. How interesting.
Yes,
okay.
But they're only a tone apart, so I imagine harmonically.
That's fine. That's fine. That's manageable. Okay, well let's see what happens. go, sir.
That was wonderful, Robert. Thank you so much. It's a joy to see you in action. Don't know what else I can really say about that. In addition to all of the things you talked about with the sort of nuts and bolts of this process, the thematic continuity and the thematic content and the sort of the logic that flowed through that, I found that particularly satisfying.
Well, thank you. You see, obviously it would be possible to improvise a fantasy based on those two tunes with a great deal more motivic freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And I could do that with no difficulty. It's actually harder, more difficult to keep on the motivic track of those tunes, to keep them central, because you're subjecting them, of course, to all sorts of developmental processes. Whereas if you feel free to just go into sequential patterns and bravura passages and so on and so forth, that they would suffice for anything that you did, not this particular piece. So the discipline of this, together with, of course, the ability to modulate, to go all over the place and find one's way back again, make this rewarding for me. And it brings me back to what you said before, because this, again, the sense of watching the piece happen. You may be the protagonist, but to a large extent, one is a witness.
Yes.
To what's going on, and I think, oh, that was all right, you know, or oh dear, I wish I could have taken that one back. Could I just sort of go back 7 seconds and then?
Well, it's interesting. I know we're moving towards the end of this conversation, which has been thoroughly enjoyable. But there was one question I had that seems to dovetail neatly with what you've just said, and that was that, you know, why do we? And let me look at my exact question. Pardon me. You know, what's the difference between improvised music and composed music? What do we get from improvised music that we don't get from composed music? And of course, you've already spoken to that risk-taking thing and the lack of familiarity with what's about to happen, et cetera, but something you just said prompted me to pose that question to you in its sort of unadulterated form.
Well, you know, the thing is that a composed piece of music is subject to intellectual processes, that there are standard ways of developing ideas. There are structural models, templates, you know, in variations, in sonata, in rondos, and in various character pieces. There are many different ways that you can do these things. And these notions inflect the choices that you make. And you may write something down and then cross it out, or write something down and finish it and then come back and think of ameliorations. I mean, very often when Mozart revises, he simplifies.
Right.
When
yes,
Bach revises,
that recently. Yes.
Yeah, when Bach revises, he mostly makes more complicated.
Okay.
So it's a different process, but you don't have the time when you improvise to work your way through that sort of thing.
Yeah, no editing allowed.
You know, look, in the glorious French organ tradition,
yes.
Nadia Boulanger used to talk to me about this because she got her prize in organ as well as piano from the Conservatoire. You would come into the room where you were being examined, and the jury was sitting there, and you were handed a slip of paper, and that slip of paper contained the subject of a fugue.
Yes.
And you had 40 seconds maximum to decide what the counter subject was going to be.
Yes.
And then you had to begin.
Wow. Yeah.
And in a sense, the French organ tradition with organ symphonies, which I experienced, played by some of the great masters, people like André Marchal or Pierre Cochereau, Messiaen, who could do these absolutely just prodigious inventions of things, even when they were given really wretched material on
yes.
purpose. I remember when Cochereau came to MIT and someone gave him a tune that went, which is really dreadful, you know. But he put his reeds on and some of his basic 8-foot flutes and so on and so forth, and he orchestrated it in such a way that it became positively sinister.
Wow. Yeah.
So the difference is essentially the lack of limitless premeditation.
That's correct.
Or
Yes.
watching the grandmaster play chess when in fact he's got to make his move in less than 5 seconds.
Yes.
You'll get a different kind of chess game than you will if they're allowed a reasonable amount of time with the clock.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many threads that I could follow with that, but I couldn't help but resist to say that my first experience of you was in the documentary on improvisation based on Derek Bailey's book, which also has an account of Messiaen talking about preparing for his final fugue. And it's been a long time since I read that book, but I think his account was that he worked for 2 years to prepare to be able to do that.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Well, it's a craft, and I think it was Renoir who said, "First, learn to be a good craftsman. This will not prevent you from becoming a genius."
Right.
And Valéry, again quoted by Nadia Boulanger so many times, said, "Talent without genius is little, but genius without talent is nothing." And so if you do not have the intellectual and digital capacity to carry out your ideas, it doesn't matter what superior imagination you possess, you will not be able to make something which is meaningful and which is articulate and, which is eloquent, unless you have developed a technique, which is why there's always going to be this kind of seesaw going back and forth between those things that prepare you and those things which liberate you. I mean, I find this terribly important. I think it's essential, and this is again something that Boulanger said, and it's something that I believe profoundly, which is the main object of a teacher is to help a young student become him or herself, which means it's not cookie cutter. You don't give the same information to everybody. There are people who do that. Galamian gave the same excellent fingerings and bowings to every violinist who came into his class.
Right.
The genius violinists became genius. The other ones could play the violin very well because of the material he gave. But that seems to me very, very strange. To me, you want people to play the same piece differently because they're different people and they approach that Brahms intermezzo differently from somebody else, and that's a good thing.
Yes, no, I really like that, the way you've expressed that and what Boulanger imparted to you in that regard.
I mean, you look at Coleman Hawkins, who essentially was responsible for a whole dynasty of tenor sax players. I mean, everybody except Lester Young, who had to go his own way, God bless him.
Yes.
But I mean, listening to Chu Berry, listening to Ben Webster, listening to all these people whom the Hawk, who Bean really influenced, it's a fantastic thing.
Yes.
By the way, maybe this will be my closing comment as linking you and me together in this way. Somebody from, I think, Downbeat magazine could have, of course, been the Daily News jazz critic, came up to Coleman Hawkins and said, "What advice would you give to young musicians?" And Coleman Hawkins said, "What I would advise young musicians to do is to do what I do every day, which is to spend 1 to 2 hours studying, listening to, and playing the music of Johann Sebastian Bach."
Oh, wow.
These cats, they think they're way out there with their imagination. Bach, he'll bring them back to earth pretty quick.
I really wasn't expecting you to say that, and that is indeed, I think we might use that as the final little bit of information. That's lovely. I really wasn't expecting you to say that.
Well, thank you, Tim. This has been a pleasure.
Yes, absolutely, Robert. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a real honour. And as I said, I do have some other questions, so perhaps we could convene another one at a later moment. But
good. I'll look forward to that.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.